Thank you, Norm. Life is good at Fulton. It is time for junior church. So all good children can go off with your wonderful teachers at this time. And while they're exiting, would you turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 12? And we'll look at verses 13 through 21 together, going through the parables of Christ. And we'll be looking at the parable of the rich fool, or addressing the problem of greed. That's what Jesus calls it anyway. So again, Luke 12, verse 13 and following. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" And then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." And then he said, "This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and all my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night, your life will be demanded of you, or from you, and then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God." Kent Hughes was a longtime pastor, College Church of Wheaton, has been a long time gone too, doing other things. But he tells a story of an English professor he had the first year he was in college. She had 5 sisters. They grew up in the Midwest town. It was during the Depression. The father, however, being a banker, managed to get through and do very well during that time. Her sisters decided to stay in that town, marry, and live out their lives there. She went off to the university, got her PhD, and then began teaching on the West Coast. And her aging father died, and so she and her husband had to rush to her hometown and home there to be there for the funeral and to also support her mother. When they got in the house of her mother, there were these little tags hanging from everything with names on them. So this sister had this, and this sister had that, and this sister had this, and they were appalled. They couldn't believe it. Just because they weren't around, they're not going to get a thing here in the estate. Well, the sisters had taken care of that. And so it was rather quiet in the house. They sat down for a meal. You could tell that people were angry and all that. And finally, this woman's husband stood up. He says, "Well, I see you have tags on everything here, all the knickknacks and things." And he says, "Well, you've tagged what you want, but we're going to tag what we want." And he walked up to his mother-in-law behind her and put his arms on her his arms on her shoulders. Kent says, "Greed is always ugly." It's always ugly. Settling an estate can turn into a fiasco and hurt relationships the rest of life. And it's all because of greed. Settling estates reveal our selfishness. I was pleasantly surprised because I didn't know how it was going to go when we settled the estates of my grandmother first, then Alice's mother, and then my mother. We came out still liking each other, even though perhaps what we inherited wasn't all equal. Everybody was happy. I have wondered, though, what will happen when our estate is divided. Already someone will say, "Oh, I love that thing." When it comes to greed, this might be a very small illustration, compared to corporate greed and the Bernie Madoffs of our life. We can compare ourselves to them and say, "I'm not greedy." But the fact is, we all have a problem one way or another, rich or poor. And that's why this illustration is so good. You take the man who tells Jesus to fix a family feud as an example, and we can relate, all of us, to it. First, the setting. Greed is a basic instinct. Jesus has been talking about serious matters. One, the cost of discipleship, or the cost of following him, and confessing him before people, that they were not to be afraid, and that the Holy Spirit would give them words and courage. And then out of the blue, this man tells Jesus to do something totally unrelated. He demands it of Christ. He doesn't ask him. He just says, hey, you tell my brother to get busy and settle up the estate here. Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family estate and give me my share. The firstborn son would get a double portion, and the rest of the kids would receive equal portions. Was the older brother dragging his feet? Was there some indication that the younger brother would, not stay with the family business, the farm or whatever it might be, and take his share and leave? We don't know. We just don't know. But there had arisen a serious rift in the family, and the cause, if you look deep down, is greed. I want what is mine. How many families do you know of where the members might get together for Christmas, because you have to, but do not speak to each other the rest of the year? Someone did not get his or hers. Rabbis were known to settle disputes. So maybe this man thought Jesus, being a rabbi, would do the same. Still, it's obvious. The man hasn't heard a word that Jesus was saying and came not to listen but to get what was coming to him. Jesus, therefore, wouldn't have any part of it. He sees right through this guy. And though it was switching gears, Jesus used the opportunity to address the problem of greed and also to issue a warning. Now, I would not have wanted to be that man, because when Jesus tells this parable, he's aiming it right at this guy, but not really at him alone. If you're that guy, you'd just want to shrink and kind of get out from the crowd there. No, he's talking to the whole crowd, and he's also talking to us. It's a basic instinct. Two things Jesus tells us. One, be careful to not let greed take over. Two, life consists of a lot more than acquiring this and that. A man is what he is, not what he has. And the Apostle Paul warns us time and time again of greed. It's right up there with idolatry. How basic is it? Well, just observe people. Observe your children. It's all over. I was up at camp many, many years ago, Fort Wilderness, and it was family camp. And this guy rolled in with this big RV, and then behind it, he was hauling this big jet ski, and he had stuff up on top, and he had bikes hanging on the back. And, you got to think, well, okay, I guess if he's got the money, what's so bad about that? The problem was the bumper sticker. Yeah, can you believe a Christian guy had this bumper sticker? He who dies with the most toys wins. Remember that one? I thought, what? This guy's got a problem. He's got a problem. Not so much with what he had, because he was well-to-do, but the attitude, the focus, the preoccupation was the problem. Greed is not about having more necessarily, but having to have more. Never being satisfied or content and able to say, this is good enough. This is good enough. You stop comparing yourself to others and so forth. And so this guy had a problem with his heart, which leads to the next couple of points, okay? One, greed is not necessarily about having much. God gives people much, and he gives other people not so much, okay? There's no equity in that, really. So it's not about whether one person has become wealthy or not. If you follow the story of the rich fool, we see that it was God who gave him his wealth. It doesn't say that he did all this work or whatever. It just said that the soil was good, and he got a bumper crop, and he became rich. So it was God who gave him his wealth. His land was fertile. He had been spared from blight and insects, and so his crops were huge. So does God have a problem with wealth, per se? No. He has a problem, though, with the desire and the love for wealth. He has a problem with focusing on it and making it too important a thing. The man's reasoning seems fine. You know, he had to do something. He had built, and so he, built bigger barns. He had a business, and as it grew, he grew with it. It's no different than building a business today. Just good common business sense. The man had come upon his wealth, it seems, honestly. He did not cheat anybody. He did not abuse his laborers. And so God blessed him. Now, I struggled with wealth early in my Christian life. I came out of school basically a socialist, That's what happens, when you go to state school. But more than that, we Christians had this problem with people having money and, spending it this way and that way. And of course, we were more spiritual than everybody, too. We were more dedicated. And when I first went to Dallas, have you ever been to Dallas? Have you ever driven around Turtle Creek? My, oh my, there is wealth there, okay? And that wealth is in the evangelical churches, too. So first Sunday after church, I'm taking to this family's home. And I'm like, whoa, like this, what I thought was maybe extravagant. But then I learned what that man was like. That even though he had been blessed with much, he used his money, and it was his vision, by the way, to start a Christian camp and lead many, many people to the Lord. That ministry continues to this day. I had to rethink that man, okay? He had been blessed with much, he enjoyed much, but he also gave much. I suppose someone could think that if they came to our house. By the way, come on over. It's okay. It's an open door, and we'll give you the 5-cent tour. There was a boy up the street, and he was very, very poor. And he was on the back porch. He's a grown man now, and he said, "Mr. MacKenzie, you sure have a nice home." I said, "Well, would you like this 5-cent tour?" He goes, "I don't have 5 cents." I said, "Well, you can go through for free, We still wave at each other, even though we've been estranged, There's just that there. My son says, "Dad, I was raised in a museum." Yeah, probably. But it isn't materialism. It isn't greed. We've scrimped, we've saved to enjoy the things that make us happy. We've sacrificed much, but we've not put on a false air of spirituality. I mean, it's the one thing that Alice and I have together. She doesn't fish, she doesn't hunt, she doesn't look for rocks, but we have the home together. Remember when my good friend True Robertson, founder and director of Fort Wilderness for many, many years, he built a house, sold his house in town, and he had sold some land that he bought when he was younger and put the money together and built the house, and he did it himself. But it was a nice house. It was a nice house. It still sits up there on the hill. It's now housing True North people. But anyway, this guy came up to him and said, "This sure is a pretty big house for a missionary." "Oh, what kind of house should a missionary have?" And he used it. He used it all the time for the Lord. So what we have per se is not bad. Greed has to do with our focus and our motives. It's the love of it, the focus we have on it, and the preoccupation of it that makes it bad. Along with that, it is not. It's how we use our wealth that matters. Ecclesiastes 5:10. Whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. This too is meaningless. So you look at the man's interpretation of what he has, and you see this change of heart, this evolution take place. Barclay says, Never has there been such a soliloquy so filled with I and my, these first-person pronouns. 5 times the word I is mentioned, 4 times my. No longer was he a steward of what God has given him. He saw it all for himself. And so he plans out his retirement with only himself in mind. And that's not a good plan, okay? Retirement is there for other reasons than just sitting back and doing nothing. What this man's life teaches us is that if we are not careful, and we do not guard our souls, we can fall into the same trap. The focus becomes acquiring more. It sort of just slips into your life, and it sops up your life and becomes what we live for. And sometimes, it could be born out of insecurity. There's this need always to feel safe. But somewhere we got to start trusting the Lord, because safe is never safe enough. Now let's talk about stewardship, which is the Christian view of money. By the way, it's the only model out there in the world. A steward was a servant of the house. There were other servants of the house, and these servants and the steward, or a main slave, were actually a part of the home and the family and so forth. The master owned everything. The steward managed everything for the master. So he made sure that, the books were kept and that people were paid accordingly and so forth. He basically managed the estate. The analogy is this, that what we have is God's. And what we have been given is what we are to manage well for him. Yes, we can enjoy, the fruits of our labor and so forth, but the money really doesn't belong to us. It belongs to God, and we are to be good stewards of it. With this perspective, we are to use our money, therefore, for good things. We're to provide for our own. We are to save and prepare for the future, and we are to use our money for God's kingdom through giving. We see just the opposite in the rich fool. Avarice had taken over. He spent his money on himself. And so, look around you. There's the poor. There's the needy. There's the widows and the orphans and the people who need some of your income. Why aren't you giving? He had become desensitized. There were 2 men that Alice and I knew up north. They bore the same first name, and that's all they had in common. They were very, very different people. The one, I used to say, made his hobby making money. He would figure out ways to make money every way he possibly could. But his motives were not good. He was never satisfied. He couldn't say, this is enough. And it made him feel big. It did. It made him feel big. He did not give. And he justified himself by criticizing our church, saying, it was not good enough. It's too liberal. I'm like, liberal? What is your definition of liberal? The other man also did very well in life. He worked hard at his business, and he built it well. By the way, he was a hard worker his whole life. Hard worker his whole life. He turned 16. When he turned 16, he got his driver's license, and he bought a milk truck. Now, only a few of you remember milk trucks, right? But he bought a milk truck, and he had a milk rack, and he would deliver milk in the morning before school and then go off to high school. That's the kind of guy he was. How many of you remember milk trucks? Yeah, not too many, right? You had a little galvanized thing there on your porch, and they put these little glass bottles of milk on our porch. Well, that's what he did. But he continued that work ethic all the way through. He was also a natural-born genius in investing stocks. He didn't have a stockbroker. He didn't somebody have, like us doing it all for him. He could do it. And so he did well. He did well. One day I went over, and there was this new fishing boat there. And I said, wow, nice boat. He goes, yeah, stock market was good. But he was a servant. He never talked about his money. He never, lived this extravagant lifestyle or something. He made sure, and he also made sure that he was not letting his wealth get the best of him. He talked to me about it. He said, I've had to guard my life to make sure that this doesn't get a hold of me. He enjoyed the fruits of his labor, as Kohelet says, the preacher in Ecclesiastes, but he didn't lose sight of God's kingdom. The worst thing that Jesus says here is that greed can actually make a man lose his own soul. The man says, I will say to my soul. And then God says, you fool, because you are going to be dead tonight. And this is the ultimate warning Jesus issues here. I mean, it's for all, Christian and non, but if you don't know God, then all you live for will end, and it will take you straight to Sheol. That's a nice word, okay? That's a nice Hebrew word. So the man died without Christ in his life. And so if you don't know Christ, that you would really reconsider. It's really too bad. This man loses 3 times. He died without God in his life. He did not take his wealth with him. And he had absolutely no control over those who would inherit it and how they would spend it. That's the last part there. Now we can apply this to ourselves in 2 ways. If there's anyone here who still is putting off salvation because you're too caught up in the now, I pray that you'd reconsider, that you'd rethink that whole issue. And 2, for us Christians, that we not lose our spiritual grip, and have sort of the spiritual life of ourselves sucked out of us. It's like the man with all the toys, he who dies with the most toys wins. The life had been sucked out of him. We should instead be rich toward God. That's the last thing here, verse 21. The person who lives for material wealth is not rich. The person who lives for God, even though he may have little in comparison to others, is rich indeed. Now, I know that's hard to accept, but it's true, and we need to train ourselves to think that way. Living for the kingdom has both present and eternal rewards. Living for the kingdom is a good thing. Living purely for now is to live for what is perishable. Or as the preacher says, not me, Kohelet, a vanity, a meaningless thing. Now I know people who have taken this to the extreme, meaning they're just too spiritual. They're just too spiritual. They don't have a practical bone in their body and they need one. Because I remember years ago, I don't know how we got on the subject, with a guy, and how was he preparing for, the retirement of he and his wife, and he, of course, he had a Social Security check that was going to be coming, but he said, no, I don't have that. He says, Lord's going to come before I retire. Really? I said to myself, boy, I think it's going to be the Great Depression when you retire. But there was another dear pastor friend, and he was so loving and so kind and so willing to be used that he was used. And therefore, Christian ministries took advantage of him. I remember he was filling an interim period for a church in upstate New York, and I went to the house and I sat down, and there was virtually nothing, just nothing. And that's just how it was for him. And I looked at him, and I looked at his wife, and I said, how does she feel about this, Oh well. And then I had this friend who wanted to be St. Francis of Assisi. He thought poverty was spiritual, and anyway, his wife did not. She's no longer with him. Self-imposed poverty does not equal spirituality. For Alice and I, we went where God led us, and we were willing to make the sacrifice, but we knew that we would have to make a change somewhere. So when that change became possible, we came up with a plan. Maybe small in comparison to others, but we've created a plan. However, let's not go to the opposite extreme. Jim Boyce, who's been dead for a long time, died of pancreatic cancer, great pastor of 10th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia there. He talks about the evolution or the development of the word mammon. We think of mammon as a negative thing. You can't serve mammon and God at the same time. Okay, but mammon was originally a neutral term. It just meant money. If it was to be used in a negative way, then they would attach an adjective to it like unrighteous, mammon. But as the term developed, it just kind of took on the negative connotation with a capital M. And he says, the same development can happen in a Christian's life if he or she is not careful. Money, it's a neutral thing, but it can become a bad thing if we love it too much. And so he says this, has things become your God? Or have things become your God? Do they obscure God? It may not be so, but if you think more about your home, car, vacation, bank account, clothes, makeup, I don't have a problem with that one, or investments than God, then you are serving mammon and building treasure on earth. Good point. Fostering a daily relationship, therefore, with God is imperative. We really have to stay alive spiritually. It just goes without saying. And caring for our own, at the same time, caring for the kingdom is important. From time to time, we need to check our hearts and, with God's help, view money properly and use it well. There's a man I've known for a lot of years. When he was a young man, about 18 or 19 years of age, he left his home. And he went to work for a businessman. And the businessman had a heart attack on the job. In fact, he literally died in my friend's arms. Yeah. And so my friend then bought that business from this man's widow. And he made it a very, very profitable business. He was a hard-working person. But he realized after many years that he was giving everything to the business, and it preoccupied his mind completely. And he knew that was not good. And so he had a change of mind. And he began, you might say he had a wake-up call where he could no longer just work for building the business, but to see the business as God's wealth to him, of which he could share much. And he remains that to this day. So, there it is, end of sermon. Let's pray. Father, thank you. We don't want to be distracted. We don't want to be persuaded away from you. We want to stay true to you. We want to have good hearts. We want to have good consciences before you. So help us to do this balancing act that you've called us to do. We pray in Jesus. Amen.